It began with a whisper behind palace walls, one that would detonate centuries of tradition. King Charles, already uneasy on the throne, receives a confidential briefing that would shake the foundation of royal inheritance. What was said in that room remains redacted from the public, but its consequences were irreversible. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The call came in late, delivered not through official palace channels, but through a coded message that bypassed the usual advisors and intermediaries. The individual who requested the meeting was not listed among the typical royal consultants or government liaisons. Instead, the source came from deep within the intelligence network, one accustomed to handling matters where silence was more valuable than protocol. Charles was escorted into a private study where phones were forbidden, records were not taken, and conversation was conducted in measured tones as though even sound carried consequences. The moment the door closed, the atmosphere shifted, something unseen but undeniably heavy. He listened, expression unreadable, as information was laid out before him. Not the ceremonially filtered knowledge intended for a king, but classified truths carved down to their most unsettling edges. When the briefing ended, there was no immediate reaction, only the slow, deliberate nod of a man realizing that the monarchy he inherited was not what he believed it to be. Palace staff later recalled that the king did not return to his private chambers that night. Instead, he paced the length of Windsor's east corridor, hands clasped behind his back, whispering to himself as though negotiating with ghosts. By dawn, the shredders had been running for hours. Documents believed to be old family correspondence, sealed archives, and restricted legal papers were destroyed before anyone could glimpse their contents. It was as though Charles was erasing the past before it had the chance to contradict the future. Multiple aides reported access to private safes that had not been opened in decades. Locks long stiff with disuse suddenly awakened. Rumors circulated in hushed, shaky voices. Dossiers compiled on unnamed royal family members, evidence that ancestry was not as straightforward as believed, proof that succession was not sacred lineage, but a story maintained for the sake of stability. The monarchy, it seemed, was not built on unbroken legacy, but on selective truths, and if those truths were ever fully revealed, the public's faith would fracture beyond repair. Something in that briefing made Charles see continuity itself as a threat. The idea began quietly, forming not from ambition but from necessity. Perhaps the line of succession had to change not to consolidate power, but to preserve the crown from internal collapse. A radical idea, but one that grew teeth the more he considered who stood next in line and what secrets they carried. The heirs, once symbols of continuity, now appeared vulnerable, compromised even. And so, alone in shadowed corridors, Charles began contemplating the unthinkable, rewriting destiny itself, altering the very order of inheritance that had defined monarchy for centuries, choosing legacy over lineage, control over tradition. But what exactly did Charles learn in that room, and why did it make the current heirs obsolete? The monarchy's facade of unity was cracking, and Charles knew it. The threats weren't just external, they were seated at his own family table. Fears of scandal, betrayal, and a hidden lineage pushed Charles to weigh the unthinkable, reshaping the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the days following the confidential briefing, Charles became a man haunted by shadows that bore the names of his own children. Beneath the royal smiles and choreographed handshakes, the relationship between father and sons had begun to disintegrate. Tensions simmered beneath every public appearance, behind every carefully worded press release. In private, it was a different story. Explosive arguments erupted behind closed palace doors, William demanding clarity on legacy, Harry coldly distant, nursing old wounds. Charles found himself torn between loyalty and doubt, tradition and survival. Then came the internal reports, classified assessments marked eyes only, hinting at dangerous moral vulnerabilities within the heirs. Nothing public, but enough to cause tremors within the monarchy's iron frame. rumours of financial improprieties, confidential therapy transcripts hinting at instability, private behaviour that could, in the wrong hands, dismantle the image of an unshakable House of Windsor. But it wasn't just the family that worried him, it was the world watching from beyond the palace gates. External players had started circling, emboldened by uncertainty. Foreign dignitaries made curious overtures to select members of the royal circle, bypassing Charles entirely. Aristocratic power brokers, many of them relics from previous reigns, whispered of a more modern monarchy, led not by Charles's chosen successor, but by someone else entirely. Whispers became proposals. Proposals turned into veiled threats. And still, Charles stood alone in the eye of the storm. His fears found new fuel in William's growing political ambitions. The prince was building alliances far beyond the crown's comfort zone, talks with global tech giants, unmonitored meetings with reformist MPs, and a tendency to speak in tones that suggested he was preparing for a very different reign. Harry, meanwhile, had slipped beyond the crown's reach entirely. From across the Atlantic, he operated with a degree of autonomy that was both liberating and dangerous. No longer bound by protocol, Harry was free to make deals, form allegiances, and speak truths the firm had long buried. And in the back of Charles's mind, the past refused to stay buried. Diana's tapes, Andrew's lawsuits, scandals that once threatened to topple the monarchy now resurfaced with chilling new relevance. What if the sins of the fathers and mothers were now resting on the shoulders of the sons? Was he truly preparing the throne for a worthy heir, or was he handing over the kingdom to a generation who could not, or would not, protect it? That question clawed at his every waking moment. "Is this the monarchy I'll leave behind?" he muttered to a trusted aide one late evening, a bitter glass of scotch untouched in his hand. The crisis wasn't just about who would rule, but about what truths the crown had buried to protect the wrong people. Behind closed doors, King Charles ordered a genealogical audit of the royal bloodline, a move so secret only 3 people were aware of it. What it revealed was shocking enough to justify rewriting the future of the monarchy. And one name, in particular, became a problem. As tensions escalated within the palace and whispers of instability grew louder, Charles realized that public perception was only half the threat. The true danger was hidden in the family's very foundation. Something in the lineage didn't align, and the time for assumptions had passed. What started as a paranoid inquiry spiraled into a covert operation involving private genealogists, former intelligence officers, and a legal strategist whose name would never appear in royal records. Their task was simple yet treacherous. Trace the line, verify the blood, expose the fractures. It didn't take long before the inconsistencies emerged subtle, buried beneath years of curated family history, but undeniable to those who knew where to look. William's maternal line raised quiet but terrifying questions. Discreet conversations behind palace walls hinted at a possibility that had always existed on the fringes of tabloid madness, but was now being examined with cold precision. An alternate paternity theory that, if proven, would collapse the very idea of his legitimacy as heir. Charles didn't want to believe it. But belief had nothing to do with power. Evidence did. And it was mounting. At the same time, whispers of doubt surrounding Harry's DNA began resurfacing, no longer brushed aside as media nonsense. The analysis wasn't just scientific, it was political, and the results weren't conclusive. They were dangerous. But the audit didn't only expose threats, it uncovered alternatives. Hidden in the recesses of Windsor's extended family tree were names long dismissed, distant cousins with clean records, untarnished public images, and, most importantly, unchallenged legitimacy. Some had been quietly serving the crown for years, unnoticed. Others were living ordinary lives, unaware they might now be seen as salvation for a monarchy on the verge of implosion. These individuals, with what Charles's legal team called constitutional strength, suddenly became options. Tools, weapons, even. But to use them, Charles needed more than knowledge, he needed legal cover. So began the back-channel consultations with constitutional lawyers. digging into succession loopholes buried under centuries of protocol. Technicalities, yes, but enough to make radical change seem plausible, even lawful, if orchestrated correctly. Through it all, Charles was unraveling. What began as a tactical inquiry had become an emotional crucible. Every report, every whispered name, every potential truth struck him like a betrayal. The faces he had loved, trusted, raised now sources of uncertainty. Alone in the corridors of power, he struggled with a truth he could never speak aloud. He no longer knew whom to trust. His legacy, his bloodline, his kingdom all stood on a precipice. And the deeper he went, the more he understood that this wasn't just a question of future leadership. It was a reckoning with the ghosts of decisions never made, secrets never spoken, and loyalties never earned. But Charles wouldn't move without an insurance policy, and that's when he turned to the one person he'd sworn to keep in the shadows. She had been mocked, sidelined, and silenced, but Camilla had never been powerless. In her possession lay a file sealed 2 decades ago, one that could burn down or resurrect an empire. And on the night of the briefing, Charles demanded she open it. Her response wasn't immediate. It came after a long, measured silence, because Camilla understood the weight of what she carried. This was not simply leverage, it was legacy, weaponized and waiting. Inside an inconspicuous leather case, hidden in the bottom drawer of a locked chest, lay her collection of royal secrets, letters soaked in emotional manipulation, recordings of private breakdowns, and a set of psychological profiles so intimate they could destabilize the monarchy if released. She hadn't built it all at once. This was a slow, strategic gathering of ammunition meticulously curated since the early 2000s, when she realized that her proximity to power would always come with conditions. Over the years, while she smiled dutifully for cameras and endured public loathing, Camilla moved in shadows. Quiet dinners with royal advisors, veiled conversations with former staff, documents exchanged discreetly, filed away for a day she prayed would never come yet secretly prepared for. And now, it had arrived. The emotional tension between her and Charles that night wasn't new, but this time, it was something colder. Not a quarrel between husband and wife, but a negotiation between two powerful entities. Loyalty versus leverage. He wanted to protect the monarchy. She wanted to ensure her survival. The file, known in hushed tones as the Camilla file, contained details that could discredit both William and Harry. Accounts of behavior shielded from public view. Excerpts from personal letters laced with emotional instability. Unfiltered assessments from private counselors. Each piece, on its own, damning. Together, explosive. But Camilla's motives were never as simple as revenge or defense. Somewhere within her ambition sat a whisper of something more audacious. Possibility. For years, royal observers had dismissed her as a consort, a shadow to Diana's enduring image. But now, there were murmurs of a new heir, one more loyal to her, less tethered to the chaos of the past. She wasn't just protecting Charles, she was repositioning herself, reframing her legacy, reshaping the very future of the monarchy she had once been forbidden to touch. As the atmosphere thickened with tension, Charles gave one final plea, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps from fear. And Camilla, poised and resolute, finally responded, "If I open this, you never undo it." He said nothing. But in his silence, she heard everything she needed. She turned, unlocked the case, and handed him the file, an empire in pages, laced with ink and betrayal. Charles didn't flinch as he opened it, because in that moment, they were no longer simply king and queen consort. They were conspirators in a silent coup. With Camilla's secrets in hand, Charles would make a move that no monarch had dared since Henry VIII. Buried within the vaults of Buckingham sat a document never meant to see daylight, a redrafted line of succession, crafted in secrecy, sanctioned under obscure emergency powers, and set to activate with a single royal signature. It was a document soaked in silent rebellion, a weapon disguised as policy. Charles, isolated by mistrust and buoyed by Camilla's arsenal of secrets, had crossed the point of no return. But he knew better than to declare war openly. This wasn't to be a loud dethronement. This was to be a clean surgical strike, wrapped in precedent, cloaked in legality. The draft had its roots in forgotten clauses from the 1700s, legal mechanisms rarely invoked but never repealed. Designed to protect the monarchy during wartime or crisis, they gave the sovereign quiet, unilateral power to preserve the crown. Charles would argue this was such a crisis of blood, trust, and destiny. What he signed next shattered centuries of tradition. The new draft rearranged the royal chessboard with chilling precision. Names were stripped of precedence, titles erased in one swift paragraph. William, once considered the unshakable heir, was no longer listed, not demoted, not deferred, simply absent. The shock this sent through the legal corridors of the monarchy was immediate and ferocious. Courtiers stared at the document in disbelief, reading the same lines over and over, searching for a justification that didn't exist. No ceremony, no discussion, just deletion. But the absence of William wasn't the only surprise. Buried deep in the revised order was a name so unexpected, so quiet in the royal fold, that it ignited furious speculation. A female royal, barely in the public eye, whose inclusion signaled something far more strategic. She had no scandals, no press history, no tabloid baggage. And, most importantly, no allegiance to William or Harry. She was neutral, loyal only to Charles, and, by proximity, to Camilla. Behind the scenes, Charles initiated a series of cloak and dagger meetings, calling upon senior peers and legacy power brokers to secure silent backing. Not all agreed, but enough were swayed by his rationale: survival. Those who questioned were reminded of the chaos looming should the current heirs ascend unchecked. Those who resisted were presented with the contents of Camilla's file. Few continued to object. Yet despite the polished signatures and silent approvals, the threat of rebellion loomed large within the palace. Household staff whispered in corridors. Security details were reshuffled. Aides who had served the crown for decades resigned overnight. The royal family itself became a battlefield of suspicion and veiled alliances. Charles had the draft, he had the power, but not the peace. Because in the heart of every conspiracy lies the same fear: what if it unravels before it's done? But Charles wasn't ready to go public, not yet. First, he needed to eliminate the only thing that could stop him: royal consent. William found out. And what followed was not a quiet negotiation, it was a full-scale family civil war. Searing accusations, broken portraits, and a fight that spilled out of the palace walls. The heir was ready to wage war against the king. It began with a whisper, slipped from the trembling lips of a royal aide too shaken to hold the weight of the secret. A copy of the shadow draft had circulated behind locked doors, but one copy unaccounted for had made its way into William's hands. The moment his eyes scanned the page and saw his name missing, something inside him detonated. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't protection. This was betrayal by his own father. A betrayal so brutal it felt surgical, cold, premeditated. He didn't wait for an audience. William stormed through the corridors of Balmoral, his voice a mix of disbelief and fury, until he found Charles standing in the garden, as if nothing had changed. What unfolded there was not fit for royal history books. It was raw, violent in tone, and devastating in impact. Charles tried to speak, tried to justify, but William had no patience for calculated words. He demanded to know how long the plan had been in motion, who else knew, and why he had been erased without a single conversation. Charles stood his ground, calm in a way that only enraged William more. He accused his father of cowardice, of hiding behind outdated laws and whispered secrets. He accused Camilla of manipulation, of poisoning the chain of command with ambition disguised as loyalty. And then came the line, "No monarch wants to hear from their son. If you go through with this, I will bury your truth with mine." William didn't wait for the storm to settle. He turned to his allies in the media, the ones who owed him favors, the ones he'd protected from past scandals. Quietly, subtly, stories began surfacing that painted a different picture of the monarchy. Glowing pieces about the prince's readiness to lead, strategic leaks that hinted at unrest in the palace, reports questioning the mental toll of kingship on Charles. The public was none the wiser to the full scope of the war, but they felt the tremors. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the family clung to the image of unity with white-knuckled desperation. Public appearances were meticulously staged, funerals, christenings, charity galas, all meant to project order while the foundation crumbled beneath them. And still, William pushed. In private, he began issuing threats, ones layered with veiled warnings. If Charles could rewrite the succession, what else might he be? Hiding? Old documents, financial arrangements, personal letters never meant to be seen. William made it known that if pushed too far, he would bring the monarchy into the light and scorch everything in its path. The palace was split. Some staff stayed loyal to Charles, bound by duty. Others, quietly disillusioned, aligned themselves with William. Convinced the wrong king now sat on the throne. The firm was no longer a united entity. It had fractured into camps, whispering war songs behind closed doors. But what William didn't know was that the public was about to be pulled into the firestorm by none other than Prince Harry. From Montecito came the storm Charles didn't expect. Harry, estranged but not irrelevant, issued an ultimatum on international television: reverse the new succession or the monarchy's darkest scandals go global. For months, he had remained silent, watching the chaos unravel across the Atlantic, unsure whether to intervene. But silence, for Harry, had always come at a cost. When a former courtier, one of the few still loyal to Diana's legacy, leaked details of the shadow draft and Charles's quiet removal of both his sons from the line of succession, the dam finally broke. In the dead of night, Harry made the decision that would rip the last thread holding the family together. He scheduled an interview, not with a British broadcaster, but with one of America's most influential anchors. This wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a warning, a declaration, and a reckoning. The world watched as Harry sat before the camera, his face solemn, voice steady, words chosen like blades. He didn't name names, he didn't have to. With surgical precision, he described a monarchy in moral decline, a family fractured by secrecy and fear. What we're witnessing, he said, isn't a transition of power. It's the end of the monarchy as we know it. His statement wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. He framed the succession, rewrite not as a legal matter, but as a betrayal of public trust. And then came the emotional twist. Harry spoke directly to the British people, his voice trembling as he recalled the pain of walking behind his mother's coffin, the silence that followed her death, and the years spent in exile for daring to speak truth. "You deserve better," he said. And so did she. Meghan's voice, though quieter, struck just as hard. In a post-interview clip released hours later, she referred to unnamed conversations within the palace that had once questioned the skin tone of her unborn son. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. The ghost of that scandal still haunted the monarchy, and her words reignited it with full force. The conversation was no longer about succession. It had returned to lineage, race, and the institution's unwillingness to face its past. Within days, US lawmakers, some of whom had remained neutral, began making statements supporting Harry's call for transparency. The British tabloids dismissed it as posturing, but the international press saw it as something far more threatening. A prince positioning himself as the voice of justice on the global stage. Yet the most devastating blow came not from the media or politics, but from history itself. In a final act of pressure, Harry's team hinted at a set of documents held in his possession, copies of entries from the late Queen Elizabeth's private diaries. Entries that reportedly contained thoughts on her children, her regrets, and most chillingly, her fears about what the crown might become. Whether authentic or not, the mere suggestion was enough to send royal advisors into panic. For Charles, it was a red alert. The monarchy wasn't just under siege, it was being held hostage by its own blood. The son he'd tried to exile had become his most dangerous opponent. Cornered and exposed, Charles knew the clock was ticking, but he had one final move, and it would shatter the kingdom. As the nation tuned in for a routine ceremonial event, few knew they were witnessing a hostile coronation coup. Charles emerged not as a ceremonial monarch, but as the architect of a rewritten dynasty. The crown passed not to his son, but to a stranger. The world watched with breath held, expecting pomp, tradition, and the familiar choreography of monarchy. What they got was disruption. In a move unseen for centuries, Charles invoked an archaic sovereign prerogative, once used only in times of national collapse, and enacted the succession draft in real time. No parliament vote, no family consensus. Just one man, one crown, and one irreversible decree. Cameras rolled as he stood at the center of the stage, not to extend his reign, but to anoint a successor no one had seen coming. The air was revealed with deliberate slowness, as if Charles knew the nation needed time to process what it was about to witness. It wasn't William, it wasn't Harry. It was a woman, quiet and composed, plucked from the shadows of the royal bloodline and thrust into the heart of empire. Her name, once insignificant in the grand tapestry of royal hierarchy, was now etched into history. The room didn't erupt, it froze. A stunned silence swept over parliament, clergy, courtiers, and global broadcasters. This was not the future anyone had prepared for. The media, caught off guard, scrambled to explain the legal foundation of such a move. Analysts debated obscure clauses from the 18th century, while legal scholars argued over legitimacy. But Charles wasn't seeking approval. He was delivering a message. The monarchy was his to redefine. The fallout was immediate. William, seated in ceremonial robes just feet away, rose with a glare of betrayal and walked out, mid-ceremony. No nod. No acknowledgement. Just a silent public fracture that would echo for generations. Moments later, from across the Atlantic, Harry posted a single message. A crown emoji, cracked in two. It needed no caption. The public began to unravel in real time. Protests flared outside the gates of Buckingham. Headlines clashed, some calling it visionary, others calling it treason. The monarchy was no longer a symbol of stability. It had become a battleground of ideology, secrecy, and raw power. And then there was Camilla, standing not behind Charles, but beside the new heir. Her smile said everything. She had orchestrated, endured, and survived. And now, with the past rewritten and the future sealed, she stood in full view of the world not as a relic of scandal, but as the architect of survival. The royal order had been shattered and reforged in a single day. But even amid the chaos and coronation, Charles knew the storm hadn't passed, it had merely shifted shape. But the shock wasn't over. One final twist remained, buried in a letter left unread for decades. In a dusty drawer at Windsor, sealed in the Queen's handwriting, lay a final letter addressed only to Charles. It contained a prophecy and a warning, one he chose to ignore, one that may now haunt the future of the crown forever. The letter was discovered by chance, or perhaps fate, just days after the coronation upheaval. An old wooden desk, untouched since Elizabeth's final weeks, revealed a single cream envelope marked simply with his name. No royal seal, no official heading, just a mother's script, sharp, familiar, deliberate. Charles opened it with trembling hands, unaware that its words would cut deeper than any public backlash or political revolt. Inside were only a few paragraphs, but each line landed like a blow to the heart. The tone was intimate, yet haunting. Elizabeth, aware that her time was drawing to a close, had written not as sovereign, but as matriarch. She spoke of legacy, not lineage. She reminded Charles that bloodlines had built the monarchy, but it was choices that preserved it. "We do not own the crown," she wrote. "We borrow it, and how we return it matters more than how we wore it." There was no mention of William or Harry, no names laid out in blame or defense. Instead, she painted a broader reflection, recalling past monarchs who had defied history's rhythm, only to find themselves undone by it. Power, she cautioned, resists containment. When used to silence fate, it returns louder. But it was the final paragraph that froze Charles in place, a cryptic line that seemed almost prophetic. In the darkest hour, a daughter of Windsor shall rise not by name, but by necessity. For a moment, Charles could not breathe. The new heir, the one he had anointed, the one Camilla had helped surface from obscurity, fit the description too closely. Had Elizabeth known? Or had her words simply been a mirror, forcing him to confront the possibility that what he believed to be his choice had already been written? He wept silent, agonizing tears, not of guilt, but of realization. The shift he had orchestrated could not be undone. The signatures had dried. The crown had changed hands. The monarchy had crossed a threshold no future sovereign would easily return from. The halls of the palace felt colder in the days that followed. Staff moved with caution. Family members avoided eye contact. Portraits of the past seemed to watch with judgment. Though the crisis had technically passed, nothing felt resolved. The monarchy had survived, but not unscathed. Its shape was altered, its soul perhaps fractured. And as Charles sat alone in the royal study, the Queen's letter beside him, her final words refused to fade. The ghosts of tradition had not left. They had merely changed their form, now haunting a new order born from secrecy, defiance, and desperation. The monarchy survived, but at what cost? And in the silence of the palace halls, the question echoes still. Did Charles save the crown, or doom it? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.